Good morning, students. I hope you're all having a good day. This is the beginning of Chapter 9, the muscular system. Now, what I'm going to try to do also is something that I really hope you will follow through on. And that is, I'm going to send an email out to announce that this is set up, and I'm going to have it placed in the e-learning site. And I have attached in that email the graphic organizer, which we'll use in a little bit. Please print it out, as well as the lecture notes. That way, when we're together on next Tuesday, we'll be able to continue this, and you should be right on top of everything. I'm going to make sure that we go through at least half of this lecture to replace what we missed yesterday due to the snowstorm and the college shutdown. I assure you that I'm going to make sure that everybody is on top of things, and we will have ample time on that Tuesday if you have any questions. So if you're following with the lecture notes, it's going to be helpful because if you have a certain area where you're not sure of something, mark it off on the lecture notes, and that way we can go over it again. I have no problem with that. Going over things to make sure that you understand them. Now, another thing is that it will help you, particularly it gets to be a bit of a stumbling block, is the excitation and contractions cycle. Is that there's about somewhere between 5 and I think 7 very good, relatively short YouTube videos that are on the week 8 lecture e-learning site. Please go into the folder for week 8 and click on those links and you will be able to see them. They should really help you. Without further ado, excuse me, we're going to move into the muscular system. And what you find is we're talking about muscle fibers. And muscle fibers are really elongated muscle cells. Myofilaments make up the contractile elements. These are composed of two proteins, one actin, one myosin of the muscle cell. Now, to help you, whenever you see this prefix, myo, mis, or sarco, it usually refers to the muscle. You may have heard someone having a sarcoma. That's a tumor of muscle tissue. Sarcolemma is the muscle cell membrane. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm within the muscle cell. Okay? Now, we're going to be dealing with 3 different types of muscle cells. The chapter that you read focuses mostly on skeletal and toward the end covers a little bit on smooth. Cardiac, we're going to touch on relatively briefly. Excuse me. And cardiac will go much more in depth in AP2 when we get into the heart, because that's primarily where you're going to find cardiac muscle. I encourage you to pull aside the graphic organizer now as we go into it. You will also see table 9.3 on pages, I believe it's 309, excuse me, correction, 310 to 311 for a general review. Now, excuse me, what do we see here? What I did was set this up to help you. So let's talk about the 3 different muscle types: skeletal, cardiac, smooth. First off, skeletal. It covers the bony skeleton. Its fibers are the longest of all muscle types. It is striated. It means that you'll see this banding here, which is basically, when you look at the cell through a microscope, these are going to be areas of density based on the fact that you're going to have both actin and myosin fibers overlapping on each other. So they're going to appear like a band. You'll see this when we get into, not next week, but the week after's lab, which will be covering the muscle. Now, also what's interesting is that this is under what's referred to as voluntary control. In other words, when you basically want to move your arm, you're aware of it, okay? Involuntary is you're not aware of something, but it's always working, such as the beating of your heart, such as moving a food through the lumen, the space of the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. You don't have to think about that stuff. You don't have to think about moving your arm necessarily, but sometimes you've got to try to really work it out, especially if it's something like it's sore or something else like that. But the bottom line is you have much more conscious control of skeletal muscle, and you do not have as much conscious control on the cardiac and smooth muscle, but we'll get a little bit more into that as time goes on. Now, skeletal muscle can contract very rapidly, and that's great. It is also multinucleated. Now, I know that we've gone through mitosis, and I mentioned most cells have one nucleus. Every once in a while, you're going to get an exception to the rule. This is one of them. You will have mitosis occurring, but you will not have with skeletal muscle cells. You will not necessarily have cytokinesis, in other words, the cell dividing into two. The interesting thing is that when you look under a microscope at skeletal muscle, you will see that the nucleus is pushed to the side because most of the volume, that is, most of the space inside the skeletal muscle, is basically composed of contractile elements, okay? Excuse me. The next one we go to is cardiac muscle. This occurs in the heart. It makes up the bulk of heart muscle walls. It is involuntary. It is uninucleate, meaning that it only has one nucleus. Now, I know I sit there uni or binucleated. Very rarely will you get a cardiac muscle cell that'll have two nuclei. For the most part, they have one nucleus. The interesting thing also is that you're going to find that the way that the cardiac muscle cells are arranged is they're in sort of branching chains. And that's because, in part, the design of that cell branches off, and you'll see this. It kind of forms like a Y. On the edges of them, from cell to cell, they'll have these intercalated discs, which allow for the synchronized contraction of all the muscle cells at the same time. Okay? Excuse me. Now, the last one is smooth. This is found in the hollow visceral organs, so in other words, digestive system. It's found in the walls of the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. It is at a variety of the sphincters, and these are kind of like valves that control what moves from one structure to another. So there is a sphincter that basically controls the food moving from the esophagus into the stomach. From the stomach into the small intestine, the beginning of it is called the duodenum. These sphincters are basically, you might call them very layered or thickened areas that are consisting of smooth muscle. Now, you will also find smooth muscle in the urinary bladder, the ureters, the uterus, the respiratory system. You will find it in large arteries. You will find it in some of the airways, particularly where you have bronchi. You will also find it in the intrinsic eye muscles. These are the eye muscles that help to control the amount of light coming in and the focus of the lens that is inside of the eye. Now, excuse me, as I said, if you take a look at table 9.3, and this is one of the pages that I would hot page, okay? Kind of make it as sort of a referral or put a tab on it so that you can quickly review it because it covers a lot of the basic meaty parts of the different types of the muscles. So body location, cell shape and appearance for the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Then, of course, the connective tissue components, the presence of myofibrils composed of sarcomeres, yes or no. The presence of T tubules and the site of invagination, yes or no. The elaborate sarcoplasmic reticulum, the presence of gap junctions. Cells exhibiting individual neuromuscular junctions, yes or no. And then the regulation of contraction. Now, some of this may seem a little bit forward, but if you've read the chapter already, you're probably familiar with a little bit of it. If not, don't worry, we'll continue to go through this as we progress through the lecture. Finally, we get some of the excuse me, some of the parts that are characteristic to the actual physical as well as biochemical mechanisms for contraction, the site of calcium regulation, presence of pacemaker cells or not. We'll get into those in a bit. Speed of contraction, rhythmic contraction, response to stretch, and what type of metabolic, that is respiration, that occurs, aerobic or anaerobic, and we'll get into that, as I said, later. What are some of the functional characteristics of muscle cells? Well, excitability, we put next to it irritability. No, it doesn't mean it's a cranky thing. What it means is that you can stimulate the muscle to contract. And depending on the different types of muscle, the different types of stimulus, you can make that muscle still contract. Everybody thinks of, well, electrical stimulation. Yeah, but you can also take a glass rod and poke it in some cases, or you can use certain chemicals. The thing is, excitability means it will respond to stimulus. Contractibility, its action is to contract. Extensibility, it can be stretched or extended. And elasticity, which means basically even though you stretch it, it can come back to a certain length, okay? And this can go on back and forth and back and forth. We'll talk about this, how certain muscles will respond to being stretched, others will not. Some of the other functions. Well, the primary functions, now we've talked about functional characteristics, but now we're talking about muscle functions. Is what does it do? Well, hey, it provides us with movement. Yes, it involves locomotion. What I mean by is you walk, you run, you crawl, you do various things. Manipulation, moving around all those things like the keyboard with your hands, with your fingers, or basically, if you're really adept, you've seen some of those people that will take a card and flip it around in their fingers, or a coin, or something else like that. A lot of neat things. And also blood transport, and it will also propel items through hollow organs. Now, keep in mind, I'm not just talking about in some regards the skeletal muscle, but also you'll find some of these functions also exist in the cardiac and in the smooth. Okay, let me go through this. Now, earlier I talked about functional characteristics, and I had to just chop out some, bear with me, for a phone call that was not expected. Now let's talk about what are some of the basic muscle functions. And these are things that you're going to see throughout in one way or another, all different types. Skeletal is easy to start thinking about, but then you have to consider about what the smooth muscle does and also the cardiac muscle. So when we talk about movement, we can talk about locomotion, standing up, walking, running, things like that. But we can also talk about manipulation, movement with things like hands, or manipulation of the body in such a way, how a ballerina is able to stand on their toes, things like that. Then we talk about blood transport. And we also have the capability to propel items through hollow organs, moving food through the digestive system. The next area is to maintain posture, that is to defy gravity. Now think about that, because that can be quite something. Everybody's familiar with some of the sci-fi movies that you've probably seen where people are floating because of zero gravity. But what if the gravity was twice the amount of Earth? Well, you would be having a real hard time and the muscles would all be straining just to maintain a standing up posture, let alone trying to move. Because now you've got a greater amount of gravity, you have a greater amount of muscle work that has to be done just to maintain your posture. Okay? Now, also, the muscles, and I've mentioned this to a point in chapter 8, when you think about it, when we were talking about joints, is they help to stabilize joints. And this goes also with muscle tone. Okay? We have to have a certain stabilization of the joints. So muscles are going to pull somewhat on tendons to create the stability to hold the joints up. You're standing up, your knees do not buckle. Your head is erect up as opposed to it flopping down with your chin hitting your chest. I mean, just all these type of things is part of posture and part of the stability of the joints to just maintain a certain uh, structure of the body. Another thing that muscles do is generate heat. If you remember our first week of lecture, we talked about homeostasis. And if you think about that, what is homeostasis? When we talk about generating heat, we're going to have the shivering. Okay? I know some people are probably shivering lately because it's so cold. But what is shivering? It is an approach in which the brain, to help the body generate heat, creates rapid muscular contractions, particularly with the skeletal muscles now. And that purpose is not to move things, not to maintain